Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson. Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Tucker Carlson sat down with Russell Brand, comedian, comedic actor. His podcast. And wide-ranging discussion. A lot of ground covered, a lot of topics discussed between the two. One of them, January 6th, election security. Put that sort of together. And here's what Tucker Carlson had to say about both, including his initial posture with respect to January 6th. His initial posture, which was changed by the institutional reaction to his initial posture. And, I feel him on this one because sort of the same thing happened to me. My initial posture, and then watching the reaction to questions being asked, to the desire for more details, changed my attitude about those who were presenting themselves as the great defenders of our democracy.
And that was a tip-off to me. I mean, I had no thought in my head as I watched this happen on television and in the subsequent weeks that U.S. law enforcement or military agencies had anything to do with it. That never crossed my mind. I never thought it was a false flag or anything like that. I'm not a conspiracist by temperament. I never thought that. And then I interviewed the chief of the Capitol Police, Stephen Sund, in an interview that was never aired on Fox, by the way. I was fired before it could air. I'm going to interview him again. But Stephen Sund was the totally non-political, worked for Nancy Pelosi. I mean, this was not some right-wing activist. He was the chief of the Capitol Police on January 6th. And he said, oh, yeah. That crowd was filled with federal agents. What? Yes. Well, he would know, of course, because he was in charge of security at the site.
Fired before that interview could air. His interview with the Capitol Police chief at the time of the January 6th, 2021 riot.
Maybe that played into why he was fired.
Maybe. He doesn't know, and he did address that. He doesn't know exactly. But just continuing on that thread. So the immediate reaction. But don't forget what he's saying about what the Capitol Police chief at the time of the riot said to him.
Any violence on January 6th, I oppose. I've said that many times. I was kind of happy to leave it where it was, which is this got completely out of hand. The only reason I ever got involved in commenting on it was, we did a show that night saying, well, this is awful, right? What happened? Was the lying about it was immediate. This was a racist, white supremacist insurrection. Well, okay. There was no indication to this day that race had anything to do with it at all. Like nothing. These are people who thought the election was stolen from them. There's some evidence they were right. We could debate that, but that's what they thought. That's a meaningful thing. If you've got a big population in your country that doesn't believe that your elections are on the level, you need to figure out a way to convince them that the elections are on the level, or else you can't have democracy because it's a faith-based system. So that was the first thing I noticed. There was no effort at all to convince people, actually, electronic voting machines are secure, which they are not. By the way, that's a lie. In any country that has electronic voting machines is by definition at risk of having its elections stolen. By definition. No country that cared about democracy would have electronic voting machines, okay? First thing. But no one even, and by the way, many Democrats have made that point. Not now, but 10 years ago. There was no effort to reassure anybody. They immediately used it as a cudgel to make their political opponents shut up, and in a lot of cases to send them to jail. So I noticed this, and I'm like, well, wait a second. Nobody here is operating in good faith at all. They're just immediately lying with maximum aggression. And anyone who asks questions about it, like me, and if you could go back and look at the tape, my first 5 shows on January 6th were like, well, yeah, it's bad, but I don't think you're telling the truth about what actually happened. Shut up! Racist! What? So that's always the key for me. If it's like an infection. you know it's infected when it hurts. You press it, you recoil. They immediately recoiled when you asked any questions about January 6th.
I like the simile with an infection, the infection. And also the point that he makes is if people have questions, your job is to answer, as a public official, your job is to answer them and present the evidence to assure them that their fears about election integrity are unfounded, rather than to castigate them and demonize them, which is the response you got from institutional interests, to Tucker's point, which is a key one. Well, in some states, we have people taking election integrity seriously. Illinois is not one of them, of course, but the Buckeye State is. Frank LaRose is the Secretary of State of the state of Ohio, and we want him to talk a little bit about election integrity because of what's happening in Ohio and because of some of the fatalism out there that suggests, we'll never have on the level election again. There's no way a Republican can win because the whole thing is rigged. Well, again, elections are state-by-state propositions, and the whole thing isn't rigged, at least where you have adults in charge that are living up to the standard of addressing questions and allaying fears with evidence and systems. Frank LaRose, Ohio Secretary of State, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Hey, good morning, Dan. Yeah, great to be on and happy to talk about what we're doing to keep our elections honest here in Ohio.
Yeah, tell us about the Data Act that's been recently enacted and the implications for election integrity there.
Yeah, so this is something that we're really proud of, and I think it's just another example of where Ohio has taken a step that other states can now follow and emulate. I got to give credit where it's due. There were a couple folks that brought this idea to us just over a year ago. One of them is a group that actually has some great Chicagoland connections. It's a group called VoteRef that's just focused on data integrity and transparency. Like, just show us the books. Let's see where the votes are and be able to sort of balance the checkbook, if you will. Another one is a group called the America First Policy Institute. And we worked with both of them, and what we found was that really state by state and truly at the local level, county by county, there is no standardized way for showing transparently how the election was run. There's really not standard definitions for these things. So imagine, I know, Dan, you've got a great business background. Imagine if you were trying to invest in a company and there were no standard charts of account, or there was no generally accepted accounting principles. You wouldn't be able to look at the financials of these different companies and make any sense of it. It would all be noise, right? And so that's kind of the way election data works on a county-by-county level. But now in Ohio, with the passage just a couple days ago of the Data Act, we're going to have a standard way to throw open the curtains and to expose for everybody to see how the data is maintained and reported at a county-by-county level. I think it's going to be really revolutionary. It's something that we're pretty excited about.
And so develop that a little bit more when you say throw the books open so that people can see election data. What is it they're going to be able to access that they can't easily access now without going through FOIA and so forth?
Well, and so that's part of the problem is that the FOIAs that you do a Freedom of Information Act request from a bunch of different counties, and you would get data that is not comparable. I'll give you an example. There was no standard definition of what is a cast ballot. Now, that seems pretty like, well, okay, it's a cast ballot. But how about when a voter shows up at a polling location and doesn't like any of the choices and then turns in their ballot blank? Does that count as a cast ballot or not? Most counties it does, but in some counties it wouldn't. Another example is just being able to look at how many registered voters were there on election day. A lot of these systems are legacy systems that have been in place for a long time, and so when the update is done, maybe on a daily or even weekly basis, when the update is done to the voter registration database, the old data is gone. It's just overwritten in the data files and it's lost in the ether. So you should be able to do a snapshot in time on election day. How many registered voters were there in your jurisdiction? How many of them cast a ballot, right? How many of them voted for candidate X and candidate Y? Of course, how you vote is strictly confidential, right? We believe in the secret ballot, but how many voters voted for this candidate? How many voters voted for that candidate? How many voters turned in an invalid ballot or spoiled their ballot by voting for too many candidates, for example? How many voters turned in a blank ballot. All of those are things you should be able to look at the accounting books, if you will, of a board of elections and tell that data just simply wasn't available. Well, we're just going to put it on the web. We're going to make it available for everybody to see it. It's kind of crowdsourcing data integrity, if you will, because it'll give voters, journalists, anybody that's interested, the chance to look at the X or Y county board of elections and say how many voters voted in this election, how many ballots were cast for this candidate, how many ballots were cast for that candidate, how many registered voters were there. There are jurisdictions still in this country, not in Ohio, but in certain places like in California, where you have more registered voters than you even have citizens according to the census. And that's because they don't do the list maintenance work of removing deceased voters. We do that on a monthly basis. They don't do the work of removing people that move out of the jurisdiction from the voter rolls. And again, you can't even get that data from most counties.
What about Zuckerberg boxes? Do you still have those in Ohio, and are they going to be part of the next election?
Yeah, so you're talking about the so-called drop boxes.
Yeah, drop
what
boxes.
What we did is work with our General Assembly to determine sort of what do we want to have here in Ohio. Of course, I'm an executive office holder, so I need to execute the law as written. And so what we worked on with our General Assembly and what we came up with is that there is a box at each county, but they're under double lock and key, meaning there's a Republican lock and a Democratic lock. They're emptied every day by a bipartisan staff. They are under video camera, 24/7 video surveillance, and those videos are available for anybody that wants them. But the key thing is this. We prohibit ballot harvesting in Ohio. You're not allowed to take other people's ballots to the Board of Elections. You can only take yours and a family member's. And so that's a big part of it. And then the other thing is we post a sign on there that says, election fraud is a felony in Ohio. That's a big prominent sign that's on there that says that if you're putting somebody else's ballot that's not a family member's in this drop box, you're committing a felony. Smile, you're on camera, that kind of thing. And so we think that we've got a good system in place where if you want to bring your ballot to the Board of Elections, which our law allows you to do, you can do that. If you work third shift, you can do it when you get off duty or whatever else. But we don't allow them to be prolific all over the state like it's happened in some states, and that's where the real concern comes in.
Is there going to be then institutional memory here, data that people can look back and compare the 2024 election to the 2020 election and look at precincts and other units of jurisdiction to see, well, what was the turnout here then versus what was the turnout this time around? And so just to do some comparison and contrast, because sometimes when you see, huge spikes in turnout, like you saw in certain urban centers and certain swing states in 2020, that's the cause for more inspection or at least more questions.
Sure. And so the Data Act, it's actually an acronym. It stands for Data Analysis, Transparency, and Archive. So what we're talking about is that last A, the archive part of this. Again, storing data is relatively inexpensive these days. And so what we're going to be creating is that data archive where you can go back historically on the Secretary of State's website and really drill down into that county level data, and we'll be creating that for many years back, and so that'll be something where you can look at historic patterns. And sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes there may be a local election that has everybody spun up, and
Sure.
So you're going to get a higher than average turnout. There may be a good reason for it, but it'll give you the ability to look at the data. Again, there's nothing to hide at a board of elections. There shouldn't be anyway.
Right.
It should be a completely transparent operation, and that's really the kind of transparency first in the nation that we're creating here in Ohio.
How do you react to what I think, heard Tucker Carlson say in his interview with Russell Brand, where he said, look, electronic voting machines are by sort of definition vulnerable. It's not to say every electronic voting machine is going to be hacked or you can't have a free and fair election with electronic voting machines, but you have to recognize the vulnerability and account for it. That's something else to be transparent about, isn't it? That no system is perfect, and we're taking these precautionary measures to ensure that the integrity of the systems as well as the count is maintained.
I would go a step further and say that nothing involving humans is ever going to be perfect, right? There's always going to be some imperfection in any human system. And so that's why we believe in redundancy. Listen, I'm an Army Green Beret. I still serve as a reservist. That's a word we use a lot in the military. There's always a backup plan and a backup plan to the backup plan. And so that redundancy is a key component of how we do it in Ohio. It starts, though, with voting machines that are never connected to the internet. And let me stomp my foot on that one. We don't allow voting machines to be connected to the internet in Ohio. They're inspected by bipartisan teams, not once a year, not once every 4 years, but once every election. In fact, that process takes a few days where they pull the machines out, they go through a checklist with a clipboard, and both Republicans and Democrats sign off. These voting machines do not have an internet connecting capability. They don't have Wi-Fi, LAN, Bluetooth, anything that connects to the outside world, and they're tested. But again, that's not the final word. The redundancy part is when we do the post-election audit. So yes, we use machines to give you the rapid result on election night with sometimes 20 or 30 different questions on any individual ballot. It would not be possible to hand count ballots quick enough. In fact, it would probably take till Thanksgiving if you were going to hand count ballots. With all the different issues that are on a ballot in the U.S. So that I've heard comparisons to other countries. Well, in other countries, France, for example, you have one thing on your ballot. Which party are you voting for parliament, right? On our ballots, you may have 20, 30 issues. So if you hand counted them, it would take forever. There would also be a human error in hand counting. That's just inevitable when you've got, millions of ballots being counted by thousands of people. So we count them electronically on election night and report it rapidly. You go to bed on election night in Ohio knowing who won or lost, or at least that unofficial result. But that's not the final word. We go back 2 weeks later and we conduct a full audit of every election. And that means that Republicans and Democrats sitting at tables at your Board of Elections count the ballots and compare them to the electronic results so they line up side by side. It's, again, kind of like balancing the checkbook. And what we've had during my administration, the 5 years I've been doing this job, is that we've had an accuracy rate of 99.9 or 99.98% when you compare the fidelity of that electronic count on election night to the hand recount, essentially, that you do with a post-election audit.
See, this is what I'm talking about. Explain, present the
Yes.
evidence, present the protocols, and you get buy-in. Good stuff. Hey, Secretary LaRose, next time you're one of those secretaries of state confabs, could you provide all this to Ali Giannoulias, our Secretary of State here, to see if he may be interested in mimicking what Ohio is doing. I know he won't be.
His street name is Ali G.
I know he won't be, but at least you can make the effort. So you say he did have the plan if he doesn't want to do it here.
It's unfortunate that other states aren't following this example. I mean, some states are, right? But, for example, your Secretary of State, I've not seen him attend the Secretary of State conferences. This is where we exchange ideas, right?
Yeah.
This is where we learn from each other because it's 50 different laboratories of democracy. Some states do it well, some states do it poorly. Ohio's been in the spotlight for like 25 years when it comes to national elections, so we've gotten good at this.
Yeah, he's not really much of an idea guy. He spends most of his times rebounding for Obama at shoot-arounds. Frank LaRose, he's the Secretary of State, State of Ohio. Secretary LaRose, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you, guys. Appreciate you exposing the truth on this.
All right, thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer.
Your show keeps me alive during the week. There's nobody I'd rather listen to between 5 and 9 in the morning than you guys.
On AM 560, The Answer.
It's summertime, and you want to keep the shop, warehouse, and other doors open for ventilation. Air circulation improves the well-being of your employees and customers, but open doors can let in